Hi, this is Medi Ivy Harrison, and I'm going to teach a class today, which should probably be with the other general writing classes. It's a topic that has come up frequently as I work with writers who are beginning their first manuscripts. I think a lot of advanced writers or professionals don't want to talk about this because it feels boring. It's simple to them. They've already figured out this skill, but I'm doing it because I think that it is really important to just address it directly and talk you through some of these basics. And another one of the reasons is that I feel like when I use jargon that I feel very comfortable with, beginning writers can often feel like they can't even ask questions about the jargon that I'm using because they feel like it will mark them as somehow stupid. So you are not stupid if you don't know all these terms already. This is a short class on point of view and tense, and it's just to help you understand what is expected. These are rules that you really can't break. So I know I talk a lot about how when you're an advanced writer, you know which rules to break and you know when to break them. These are really basic rules of how you write. And if you don't write using these rules, it can be really confusing. So, all right, to the screen. All right, here we go. Which character's point of view are you in? This is one of the first questions you need to ask yourself. And I recognize that for many beginning writers, this is a difficult question for them to answer because they aren't necessarily sure whose character's point of view they are in. They're just telling a story. And before you become conscious of scene and before you become conscious of point of view, you don't see these things that are behind all of the writing that you enjoy. So one of the questions you ask yourself through this is, which person are you using? And again, I know that feels like that's jargony and really technical. This is the stuff that you skipped over when you learned grammar that you don't like to remember. It helped me because I learned German grammar when I was in 7th and 8th grade, starting there. So that helped me to understand first person is ich in German, second person is du, third is er oder sie in singular. If you have learned a foreign language, it might be helpful for you to use these skills here. Spanish, French, most foreign languages have these sort of rules. So are you telling the story from the point of view of I? Like, I went to the store. I talked to this person. I brought home groceries. Or are you saying, he went to the store. He talked to this person. He brought home groceries. Those are more common. Less common is you, but it can be done. You can say, you went to the store, you met someone, you bought groceries. All right? That may sound ridiculous, but for instance, if you're writing a self-help book, you will use second person a lot because you are telling someone the instructions. If you're doing a recipe book, again, second person will come up. It is much rarer in fiction, but it does exist. It is rather experimental. Once you start getting into it, then it feels more natural, but there is a barrier to begin with. Another question you want to ask yourself is, how tightly are you in that person's head? How much do you know of what they are thinking? Or is it a more filmic point of view where you see what they see but don't get their emotion, sometimes called objective? Think about this for a minute. When I encourage people to write in emotion, I am assuming that they are writing in third person, what's often called tight. Meaning you are in that person's head and you know everything that they know and you feel what they feel. But if you are doing a more filmic point of view, where you're just narrating the events, you don't have that emotional part. I generally recommend against that point of view because I think that it lacks a certain thing. It lacks the ability to draw in the reader because of that lack of emotion, but it is done sometimes. All right, once you have chosen a point of view for a particular scene, there's some questions you have to ask yourself because you have limited yourself. So, what information can this character know and what information can't they know? This is a problem for me whenever I do my Linda Wallheim books because those are mystery novels. And if you use a different point of view, then I'm using first person, so I tell everything from Linda's point of view. That has a massive disadvantage in a mystery novel because it means I can never tell a scene from the point of view of the villain. I can never show a scene where Linda is not in the scene. She has to be part of the scene or else it doesn't work. The advantage of having Linda as the narrator is that I get to show how she sees herself and how she would describe herself. So her voice colors all of the information while in her point of view. So she can talk about Mormonism from her point of view, and that's all she does. She just tells you what she thinks Mormonism is. She can't tell you what other people think Mormonism is. She also can't tell you lots of other things, like what their politics are, why they believe what they believe. She can make guesses at it, but she can't actually tell you that information. So again, you need to remember, once you have chosen a character and a point of view, it limits you because you can only tell us what they know, what they feel, what they believe. You can tell us what they guess at for other people, but you need to make it really clear that they're guessing at it. So I find myself as a mentor and critiquer pointing out frequently to people that person can't know that information. All right, here we go. Omniscient point of view. So you're saying to yourself, oh, I'll solve this by having omniscient point of view. Then I can tell you what everybody thinks. All right, but it's very tricky to use omniscient point of view in modern writing. Yes, it's what Jane Austen used and most writers before 1900. 1900 is about when the change happened, when we sort of think of modern literature as beginning. If you are used to reading 19th century and 18th century writers, you will be used to their omniscient point of view. It is not typically used today. I see it occasionally. I think I read Celeste Ng's Little Fires Everywhere recently, and I think she uses something close to omniscient. She has so many points of view that she gets into their heads. It isn't completely omniscient, but it might feel omniscient if you read it. I think it's still a limited third person point of view with like multiple third point of view characters. I think there are 6 or 7. But she is very careful to mark when she's moving in and out of someone's head. She doesn't do it scene by scene. So sometimes you'll have a scene where part of the scene is told in one person's point of view and part of the scene is told in another person's point of view. That is fairly uncommon. Generally in modern writing, you are expected to tell a single scene from one person's point of view and then have a line break and then move on to a different person's point of view, or even more preferably to keep a chapter in one person's point of view. If you do omniscient, then that often requires the creation of a narrator persona who has a particular voice judging the people whose stories are being told. And again, if you go back and read Austen, you will see she does have a narrator. I don't know if that narrator is Austen herself. I don't think so. I think it's a made-up persona who's persnickety and likes to make fun of other people. And that narrator tells you things about those people, makes judgments about people. That is the way an omniscient works. Limited third person can only tell you what the different people think about themselves. There's not an overarching person telling you. All right, here's just some quick examples of omniscient point of view. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. Again, this is something that only works in omniscient point of view because she's making these grand, sweeping assumptions about all of humanity and judging people and saying, you know, proclaiming this as a truth, right? That is an omniscient narrator who's saying that. This isn't a person who's thinking this in the novel. Persuaded as Miss Bingley was that Darcy admired Elizabeth, this was not the best method of recommending herself. But angry people are not always wise. He was resolutely silent, however, and from a determination of making him speak, she continued, I remember when we first knew her in Hertfordshire, how amazed we all were to find that she was a reputed beauty, and I particularly recollect your saying one night, after they had been dining at Netherfield, she a beauty, I should as soon call her mother a wit. But afterwards she seemed to improve on you, and I believe you thought her rather pretty at one time. Yes, replied Darcy, who could contain himself no longer, but that was only when I first saw her, for it is many months since I have considered her as one of the finest women of my acquaintance. This is one of my favorite scenes, so I repeated it here for you, but it's also a useful way for me to show you how, in the first sentence, Miss Bingley is the point of view, then he was resolutely silent, however, So is that his point of view or is that her point of view? No, I'm not sure. And she says, she a beauty, I should soon call her mother a wit. That's still in Miss Bingley's point of view. But now, yes, replied Darcy, who could contain himself no longer. Once you have told us he can contain himself no longer, that is not Miss Bingley. Now we are into Darcy's point of view. So we've shifted in this one scene, in this one part of a scene. And the shifting goes back and forth throughout the scene, as it does through all of Jane Austen. That is what Omniscient is. First person narrative, all told from the perspective of the I narrator. This is very limiting because you can only tell the reader what the narrator knows. And I talked about this with my Linda Wollheim character. It allows for great voice, marvelous voice. I love first person for this reason. Young adult fiction uses first person almost as a default. It's very common. If you don't have a great voice, I don't know that you should be using first person. It's a place for you to really allow voice to shine, like uniqueness, differences, ways of seeing the world. You don't have a flavorless description of someone's house or the mountains if you're using first person, because that first person narrator is the one who sees everything. They're not going to tell you information about stuff they don't care about. If they didn't notice the mountains that morning, they're not going to tell you about the mountains. If they don't notice what that person's car is, what brand it is, they're not going to tell you that information. They can only tell you the information that they care about and that they notice. Again, this is limiting. You can only depict the things that the narrator knows. And I've struggled with this with Linda Wollheim. If I want to have a scene where she isn't exactly in the room, but maybe she can overhear it. I mean, yes, I can do that sometimes, but only when she could actually overhear it. And it can get old quickly if you keep using that device. Here's some examples of first person point of view. And I already said it's very common in young adult, almost the default. So both of these examples are in fact from young adult. This is from The Hunger Games. Prim, the strangled cry comes out of my throat and my muscles begin to move again. Prim! I don't need to shove through the crowd. The other kids make way immediately, allowing me a straight path to the stage. I reach her just as she is about to mount the steps. With one sweep of my arm, I push her behind me. I volunteer, I gasp. I volunteer as tribute. So first person. From Fault in Our Stars. Once we got around the circle, Patrick always asked if anyone wanted to share, and then began the circle jerk of support, everyone talking about fighting and battling and winning and shrinking and scanning. To be fair to Patrick, he let us talk about dying too. But most of them weren't dying. Most would live into adulthood, as Patrick had. Can you see how much of her point of view is in this, what may seem like a very simple description of this characters around her? This paragraph is carrying so much at once. It tells you so much about the narrator. It also tells you about the people around her, but all colored with her own opinion and her own feelings, her own hurts, her fears. All right, third person. Third person is told from inside the head of one person. It can be almost as close as first person to their thoughts and feelings to make them available to the reader. But again, limited in that they cannot know the thoughts of other people. They can guess based on body language, facial expression, or knowledge of the person. They can also only see scenes unfold around them if they are in the room, or they have to eavesdrop like Linda does. It has many of the same limitations as first person, but also some of the same pleasures where you get to do voice. I think third person doesn't have quite as much voice. I remember, so my first novel, The Monster in Me, is told in first person. And I think I picked that partly just because it was the default for young adult at that time. But my novel, and Mirror Mirror, which is my second novel, also told in first person. But my third book, The Princess and the Hound, is told in third person. And I chose it on purpose because I wanted it to feel like a fairy tale. I wanted it to feel like normal fantasy. And I think third person is the default for fantasy stories. So I chose that on purpose. I wanted to see if I could do it also. I think that third person has a little less voice than first person does and offers maybe a little more objectivity. Or maybe that's just a lie that I'm telling myself. All right, examples of third person point of view. This is from Charlotte's Web. The goose shouted to the nearest cow that Wilbur was free, and soon all the cows knew. Then one of the cows told one of the sheep, and soon all the sheep knew. The lambs learned about it from their mothers. The horses in their stalls in the barn pricked up their ears when they heard the goose hollering, and soon the horses had caught on to what was happening. Middle grade, which Charlotte Webb's is, middle grade is the age group before young adult. So generally like 3rd to 5th grade. 6th graders are often reading young adult by then. The middle grade is often in 3rd person because in part middle graders don't understand 1st person as well. They don't pick up on voice as well, you know, Junie B. Jones notwithstanding. But it allows for more objective storytelling. And I often think of middle grade as the stories that you can tell to the whole family all at the same time. All right, multiple 3rd person narrators. This is distinguished from omniscient because you usually switch narrators between chapters or between scenes, and there's often a line break to mark the new narrator. I've talked about this a little bit before. Let's go into it more carefully. It is still only a limited number of viewpoints, unlike omniscient, which can tell you anything about anyone at any time. So most of the time when I see multiple 3rd person narrators, it is only 2 narrators and the story alternates from those 2 points of view. So for example, just from my own books, my 4th book, The Princess and the Bear, is told from the alternating viewpoints of the hound in the first novel, the Princess and the Hound, and the bear. And both of them have human personas. So the hound and the bear tell the story back and forth. And when I first started writing it, I wrote them just 1 chapter, 1 chapter, 1 chapter, 1 chapter. But my editor ended up asking me, is that the way you want to do it? It was something we discussed several times over. And finally, when I wrote The Rose Throne, which is also told from 2 princesses' point of view, we decided that I needed to introduce one of the princesses with like a 4 chapter arc, and then the other princess with a 3 chapter arc. And then I went back and forth, but not necessarily chapter by chapter. But again, those are only 2 narrators. Then I talk about fantasy epics where the author wants to be able to show too many scenes for one character to be personally involved in. So many fantasy epics have 5 or 6 characters, I would say, generally, and then some get into the hundreds. My understanding is that Robert Jordan, in his epic fantasy series, has hundreds, more than 100 point of view characters. George R. R. Martin, I think, has dozens. It is hard for you as the writer to keep track of that many point of view characters. So I generally recommend it as a beginning. I generally don't recommend it as a beginning writer strategy. I think you're better off sticking to, 2 3rd person narrators, but it might be that your particular story demands more than that. So you're just going to have to go with that, especially if there's just no way that you can have 2 characters see all of the events that are important to your story. Okay, examples of 3rd person narrative. I've said Brandon Sanderson, George R. R. Martin, those are both fantasy writers. Timothy Hallinan, though, who's one of my favorite mystery writers, also uses multiple 3rd person narrative, and many mystery writers do. Again, because they need the flexibility to be able to show you scenes from many different points of view, because they want to be able to show a scene from the villain's point of view. They want to be able to show a scene from the victim's point of view and from all of the suspects' point of view, for instance. Multiple 1st person narrators, as with multiple 3rd person narratives, multiple 1st person narratives are used between chapters or scenes and often marked with a line break between the narratives. There is no need to explain how these narratives came to be collected, but that can be done if desired. I do remember a writer telling me once that you can't write in 1st person unless you explain at the end of the story how this person came to be writing this story. And I was like, no, I mean, young adult, you don't have to explain. They don't have to be writing a journal. They don't have to like somehow tell you how this narrative came to be published. It's just a convention, and you just use that point of view. But multiple 1st person is more unusual, all right? If necessary, you can mark the narrator at the beginning of each chapter or when you switch for each scene. This is just helpful information for the reader to make sure they catch I've changed narrators. You can do that helpful information, 1st person narrators or 3rd person narrators if you have multiple narrators. Examples of multiple first-person narratives: Vladimir Nabokov's Pale Fire, William Faulkner, As I Lay Dying. As I said, it's not super common. Mixed narration. You can do first person and third person. It can be done when one of the characters is more intimate or is always the first person narrator, and the third person narrator is added for just a few chapters. That's more common, but some people just feel like third person needs to be this character's way of talking and first person needs to be this other character's way of talking. And they're often right. It works weirdly, even if they alternate and there's a lot of both of the third person and the first person. All right, this is my tip for you. Don't introduce a new viewpoint character halfway through the book. It alienates the reader in general. So if you plan to use a viewpoint character later on in your novel, then you need to introduce that viewpoint character in at least a short section in the first part of the book, so the reader gets to know them in the beginning and is not like blindsided by, wait, who's that? What's going on now? All right, now we're moving on to the section on tense. Again, I know that this feels jargony and technical, and why do I have to be so particular? I'm trying really hard not to be a grammar Nazi, although that is my tendency. I loved grammar when I was in high school. I kind of wished sometimes that people did grammar more and talked more about. I would love to do sentences and diagram them in little pretty pictures, and like that would be something I would be really good at, but not everybody is good at that. I understand that. Not everybody thinks about language as bits and pieces of different parts of speech. So I'm going to try to explain this in as simplest way as possible without getting into the nitty-gritty. Okay, so again, I'm going to try not to use too much jargon. So tense is a verb form. That means it's a way that you change the verb to mark time. So present tense is I'm walking to the store or I walk to the store. Simple past is I walked to the store. This is where we use the ed. Yes, there are some cases where we have irregular verbs like I was angry, from I am angry to I was angry. That's irregular because it doesn't just use an ed, okay? You have pluperfect, which is I had walked to the store. Now, you use pluperfect only when you're distinguishing between a past and a past even further past than the past, okay? So I had walked to the store before I came home with the groceries. Future, rarely used, but possible, I will walk to the store. I think I've read a couple of books that were written in the future tense. I don't recommend it. It is highly experimental. All right, most of the time you want to stay in the same tense. So if you begin in the present tense, you want to tell the whole story in the present tense, except for parts that happened in the past of the present tense that you're telling the story. So if you're telling something that happened a month ago, and then in the midst of that story, you tell something that happened 6 years ago, then you would use the simple past for that. I hope I'm making this clear. If you begin in past tense, then you tell the whole story in past tense, except for the parts that happen even further in the past, which are in the pluperfect past, the had past. It can be easy to slip into present tense. This is why sometimes I tell people to hire an editor just to catch some of these things, because in casual English conversation, we often retell stories in present tense, so it can be easy to slip into that when telling stories in a novel. Also, in casual conversation, nobody is policing what tense you're telling in the story. Like they'll figure it out if you slip around in tense. So you may not be used to noticing this. So watch carefully. It's hard because some parts of the story happen before other parts of the story. So those have to be marked as extra past. Like, as I said, the pluperfect or the had. Other languages have other styles. I don't know why I bring this up, except if you happen to speak a different language, then you may be confused by this. Some languages have a literary present tense. Some languages have a special tense for literary storytelling. So English in general uses the simple past for storytelling. But as I said, in casual English conversation, you can use the present tense even for things that happened in the past. Here, let me just show you an example. So I'm walking to the store and I open the door and then there's this person there And I never met them before, but they suddenly are like, hey, how are you? So I pretend that I know them. And then we're talking and talking and talking. We talk for the whole time I'm in the store. And when I've checked out and I still don't remember their name, and they leave and I still don't know who they are. Okay, so I am telling that story in present tense, but you as the listener know that it's not happening right now because you're staring at me and we're having this conversation right now. You know that it's in the past. As I said, that happens in conversation more than it happens in writing. Is present tense bad if you're writing? So it used to be very uncommon, only used in experimental writing, but this is no longer true, and I have seen it in virtually every genre. Most readers get used to it and start to read it as easily as past most of the time. Some readers intensely dislike it and find it wearing because it feels too intense, like, this is all happening right now. I've had readers tell me that that's how they feel. That is not how I feel. It is common, particularly in young adult fiction, where it may feel a bit more in the moment. That's all I'm going to say about it. I'm again not trying to prescribe for you whether you should write in past or present. I'm only telling you that once you have chosen present tense, you have to stay in present tense, except for events that happen even more in the past than the events that you're telling. What is the most common way to tell stories? Usually third person limited, one person, meaning not multiple narrators, past tense, but multiple third person past tense is almost as common. So third person, past tense, most common. Multiple third person, past tense, also fairly common. And then this is just another piece of advice, a kind of a nitpicky thing that I end up bringing up with a lot of people. This isn't necessarily about tense or person, but it is about introducing your reader to the story. So I keep telling people most of the time you should tell a name and a gender on the first page of the main viewpoint character that you're using. Name and gender, also an age if particularly relevant, particularly in children's fiction. If you haven't told me how old your character is on the first page, then I'm going to sit there trying to guess at, are they 12? Are they 15? Are they 9? And it makes a big difference in the story that if these events are happening to a 9-year-old versus to a 15-year-old. And one of the things that's saddest for me as a critiquer is to say, I'm sorry, your 9-year-old feels too old, or your 15-year-old feels too young. So if you establish it early on, maybe even in you in your head can remind yourself, okay, is this how a 9-year-old sounds? Or is this how a 15-year-old sounds? There are, of course, cases where the authors don't want to tell you the name and gender or age of a reader on the first page. So one example of this is John Scalzi's Lock-In. It's a science fiction book where the narrator uses a robot body. Because they have a disease, they are locked in. Their body is in a bedroom. They can't move, but they can manipulate the robot body. So he deliberately gave a gender-neutral name to the main character to make readers see their own gender assumptions. And in fact, the audiobook has a male narrator and a female narrator. You can pick whichever one you want to listen to. It's a weird book, but again, I'm just trying to show you, you have to have an unusual reason to not tell me this information. All right, here's some resources. You probably already will have this PowerPoint when you're looking through this. So here's some other ways for people talking about point of view and tense. That is hopefully useful. Okay. This is me just coming back at the end, trying to give you like a pep talk here. I hope this has not been too technical. I don't want you to stop writing before you learn these things, but this is a way for me to tell people that I work with, hey, here, I have this class already, just go there and listen to it and it will explain these things so I don't have to explain over and over again to people what I mean by point of view and what I mean by tense. I have tried to only explain the parts that are most important for writing. And if this is something that really troubles you and you keep having trouble with, again, hire somebody to clean it up for you before you submit it to an agent. I think that's my best advice. You will get used to writing it the correct way. You will figure this out. It might not be on your first book, but you will get good at this, I promise.